For centuries, writers have created, or perhaps discovered would be a better word, other worlds, bizarre and beautiful realms that lie just behind the mind's eye or beyond human experience. Currently, one of the most popular and successful of these worldsmiths is Terry Pratchett, author of 20 novels about the Discworld, the latest of which, Hogfather, has just been published. The Discworld series have sold and are still selling in their millions and have been translated into over 20 languages. Before I talk to the chronicler of the Discworld, here's a short lesson in cosmology. It's not all you need to know about the Discworld, but it is at least a start.
In a distant and second-hand set of dimensions, in an astral plane that was never meant to fly, the curling star mists waver and part. See! Great Archwin the turtle comes swimming slowly through the interstellar gulf, hydrogen frost on his ponderous limbs, his huge and ancient shell pocked with meteor craters. Through sea-sized eyes that are crusted with rheum and asteroid dust, he stares fixedly at the destination. In a brain bigger than a city, with geological slowness, he thinks only of the weight. Most of the weight is, of course, accounted for by Beryllia, Tubal, Great Typhon, and Jerakeen, the 4 giant elephants, upon whose broad and star-tanned shoulders the disk of the world rests, garlanded by the long waterfall at its vast circumference, and domed by the baby-blue vault of heaven.
An extract from The Colour of Magic, an ancient text that was actually only published 13 years ago, but which seems a lot older. The man who penned that mythological description was Terry Pratchett, and he joins me now. Why a Discworld?
I think that I decided to write Discworld because I'd got fed up with the fantasy that was being written by the people who had been influenced by the people who had been influenced by the people who had been influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien, the creator of Lord of the Rings. And so there was too much fantasy around where people said things like, belike he will wax wroth, or ho landlord, a pint of your finest ale. There were too many people, in fact, not acting in a properly human fashion. So I wanted to write a fantasy series set on a world that was as ridiculous as it could be, but I wanted to make the people as realistic as I could, because it had seemed to me that by putting realistic people with what we would recognise in the 80s and the 90s as the normal reactions of the average sensible person in a classic fantasy universe would automatically generate humour. I chose the geographical shape of the Discworld because it's straight out of world mythology. A flat world on the back of 4 elephants going through space on the shell of a giant turtle. You can find variants on that myth in many world religions.
What kind of people read Discworld novels?
To judge from my mailbag, 50% male, 50% female, the female readership tends to be older than the male readership. In fact, probably 50% of the female readership is over the age of 35, insofar as I can deduce this from the letters.
Do you get a lot of letters?
Too many, and lots of emails as well. I say too many. An author shouldn't say that sort of thing. And in fact, when I was about, 16 or 17, I actually wrote a letter to J.R.R. Tolkien, creator of Lord of the Rings, praising a particular book he'd written, which I think was Farmer Giles of Ham. And he wrote back. And those were the days when he was the hottest thing, and poor kids were being christened Galadriel and Bilbo after a heroine and a hero in the books. And hippies in America were opening restaurants named after him. And he wrote back, and I thought, my God, if that man can write back to me, then I can write back to my fans.
Do you get letters from all over the world?
Yes, increasingly so. Norway is very big at the moment. I don't know why this is. I'm getting a lot of Norwegian letters, lots of Australian ones. The French ones are just starting to come because I haven't been published in France for very long. The Czech ones now turn up all the time. I've suddenly becoming incredibly big in the Czech Republic. Lots of American ones, of course. They come from all over now.
You said that the books began as a reaction to fantasy writers, and yet you are yourself labelled as a fantasy writer. And your latest book, Hogfather, is, in some sense anyway, about the importance of fantasy. This conversation we're about to hear is between Death, yes, Death, the skeletal shrouded figure in black carrying a scythe, and his granddaughter. I can't go into why Death has a granddaughter called Susan, but that's another story in one of the other books. But here they are talking about fantasy.
I am nothing if not literal-minded. Trickery with words is where humans live. All right, said Susan. I'm not stupid. You're saying humans need fantasies to make life bearable. Really? As if it was some kind of pink pill? No. Humans need fantasy to be human. To be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. Tooth fairies? Hogfathers? Little... Yes. As practice. You have to start out learning to believe the little lies. So we can believe the big ones? Yes. Justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing. They're not the same at all. You think so? Then take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder and sieve it through the finest sieve, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy. And yet... Death waved a hand. And yet you act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged. Yes, but people have got to believe that, or what's the point? My point exactly.
That's an interesting view of fantasy, because it suggests that fantasy is about untruths, about lies, and yet that those lies, big or small, are actually very important to us. Why do you believe that?
I believe it because it's manifestly true. Pure science tells us that we are risen apes on a rock, which, as far as we are aware, is not a whole lot different from billions of other rocks in an endless and by and large lifeless galaxy, and for all we know, we may be the only ones. And while we long ago gave up the notion that the sun was the centre of the universe, it's going to be quite a long time before we ever give up the notion that we are the centre of the universe.
You suggest if we lose sight of the small fantasies, we can't believe the greater fantasies, as you put it there, or as Death puts it. But you also say that those greater fantasies are not true anyway. We need them. We may need to believe in them, but they don't exist. It's a slightly cynical view, isn't it?
It's extremely cynical. But Death says that you can grind the universe down to the smallest particle and you won't find a single atom of justice. But we have created the myth of justice. And I would actually say that by creating it and believing it, we have to some extent called it into being. They're all one, the Tooth Fairy, Father Christmas, or Hogfather as he is in that book, and justice. And to an extent, mercy. They're all part of the same things. We have built this huge network of things which we believe in, which have no independent existence outside us whatsoever. And we live by them. We have built this raft of belief in this huge, cold, uncaring universe, and it is carrying us along.
You've taken many of those myths, stories, lies. J.R.R. Tolkien once referred to those things as lithes breathe through silver. And amongst the things you've used, of course, have been also religious imagery, because you've taken the kind of elements that have made up the faith of many different people and held that up to the curious mirror of Discworld. In this particular extract from your book, Small Gods, there's a discussion about religion.
There are billions of gods in the world. They swarm as thick as herring roe. Most of them are too small to see and never get worshipped, at least by anything bigger than bacteria, who never say their prayers and don't demand much in the way of miracles. They are the small gods, the spirits of places where two ant trails cross, the gods of microclimates down between the grass roots. And most of them stay that way, because what they lack is belief. A handful, though, go on to greater things. Anything may trigger it. A shepherd seeking a lost lamb finds it among the briars and takes a minute or two to build a small cairn of stones, in general thanks to whatever spirits might be around the place. Or a peculiarly shaped tree becomes associated with a cure for disease. Or someone carves a spiral on an isolated stone. Because what gods need is belief, and what humans want is gods. Often it stops there, but sometimes it goes further. More rocks are added, more stones are raised, a temple is built on the site where the tree once stood. The god grows in strength, the belief of its worshippers raising it upwards like 1,000 tons of rocket fuel. For a very few, the sky's the limit, and sometimes not even that.
Do people find some of the ways in which you look at things, like, for example, the way you're talking there about matters of faith, as being, I don't know, irreverent seems a wrong word, but as being a problematical way of looking at things?
Oddly enough, some of the nicest mail I've had from fans was about small gods, from committed pagans and from committed Christians, and both of them thought that I was saying exactly the right things, because in Small Gods I was making a careful distinction between faith and dogmatic religion. And no matter how dogmatic one's religion may in fact be, most people like to think that it's founded on faith. And what Small Gods was really about was how dogmatic religion can drive a wedge between the believer and the god. Name your own god and name your own type of believer.
You say you don't really know how it all started, but did it start by your wanting to be a writer when you were young?
I always wanted to be a writer or a storyteller. And that started at a fairly early age, and I got a job in journalism because that was the way of telling stories while getting paid. So there's always been that certain urge.
Did you read a lot when you were a child?
Not until about the age of 10. Then I think from the age of 10 to 15, you couldn't get me away from a book with a crowbar. I read a massive amount, an unhealthy amount of books, to the extent that books defined my life rather more than ordinary experience did. So I had to go through my adolescence rather later than other people. In fact, I was about 45 when it began. I derived an awful lot of experience from books.
Did you read a lot of fantasy and science fiction when you were young?
There wasn't enough fantasy and science fiction around in those days. So I exhausted what little was available in the library, and then I started reading ancient history and mythology, and I read them as if they were fantasy.
Perhaps they are, of course.
Well, if we take my lying theory of human development, they're all of them lies, but some of them are better lies than others. Some lies actually can fly. There wasn't enough science fiction around, so I started reading astronomy and paleontology and even not geography so much as geological studies. And I read these as if they were science fiction, because a good book on paleontology is better than an awful lot of science fiction. And so my interest in science fiction and fantasy, in fact, gave me a sort of education, and it was the best kind of education, because it's the education that you don't know that you're getting. The eclectic reading that you experienced when you were young has led to many influences on the Discworld and the things that happen there, and you draw on all those traditions and genres in your writing. But in the Discworld, they're always very different. A sorcerer may not actually be able to spell the word wizard, for example. Swords tend to be generally unmagical and more likely to give you blisters, and barbarian warriors tend to have very few teeth and are getting rather rheumatic-y. And dragons, as in this extract from your book Guards, are anything but playful.
A slate slid down the roof and smashed on the cobbles beside him. "Captain!" hissed Sergeant Colon. "What?" "It's on the roof, Captain." He looked up. The dragon, was peering down interestedly over the guttering. Its face alone was taller than a man. Its eyes were the size of very large eyes, coloured a smouldering red and filled with an intelligence that had nothing to do with human beings. It was far older, for one thing. It was an intelligence that had already been long basted in guile and marinated in cunning by the time a group of almost monkeys were wondering whether standing on two legs was a good career move. It wasn't an intelligence that had any truck with, or even understood, the arts of diplomacy. It wouldn't play with you, or ask you riddles, but it understood all about arrogance and power and cruelty, and if it could possibly manage it, it would burn your head off, because it liked to.
It seems to me that you've inverted all the traditional imagery of fantasy, fairy tale and folklore, and you've made us say, hang on, it's not quite like the way we always thought it was.
Inversion, in fact, is at the heart of fantasy. I wish I could say that I invented that idea. I have to admit that I perhaps came to it independently, because the man who spelled it out first of all was G.K. Chesterton, when he said, in effect, that the role of fantasy was to take the familiar, that which you have seen every day, to the extent that you no longer look at it at all. Take the familiar and turn it around 180 degrees and show it to you again, so that you look at it in surprise and shock and see it again anew for the first time. That is what the best fantasy can do. It can make you say, I've never thought of it like that before.
In your latest book, Hogfather, you're holding that mirror up to the traditions and bizarre rituals of Christmas. Was that something you thought was ripe for having fun poked at it?
Not so much fun. If there were other things I wanted to say, they were very simple things, such as we do need that magic in our lives. But the fantasy in our lives, it's not the fairies, the gnomes, the bit of Disney. It is often the things that we think of as being very, very serious. I was incredibly pleased a few years ago when the whole planet on its televisions, or at least that part of the planet which owns televisions, saw huge chunks of ice slap into Jupiter. Any single one of those lumps of ice would have put a serious crimp in our technological civilization had it hit the Earth. But I heard an interview with an elderly lady, a woman in the street, who was asked what she thought about this, and she said, well, that sort of thing doesn't bother me, it just happens in outer space. And clearly, as far as she was concerned, we weren't in outer space. And that was a fantasy. That was, her personal mythology. And that's what actually turns us into human beings, because we take this huge, unimaginable universe, one that we couldn't possibly comprehend, that would turn us insane if we ever really tried to get our heads around it, and we chop it up into these very manageable little pieces so that we can think about it. And I think that's we are all fantasists at heart, and compared to that, tinkly bells and fairy pixies are child's play.
We talk about things as being the icing on the cake. The icing on the Christmas cake of the Hogfather is all the fun you have at the expense of things of people eating too much and getting together for family reunions, which nobody actually really wants to be at, and which are only going to be really successful if there's a great big row between everybody.
Oh, yeah.
But you also have a lot of fun with the notion of this figure of Father Christmas, Santa Claus, the mythical gift bringer who climbs down chimneys and delivers toys to children. In your book, the equivalent, the Discworld equivalent, Hogfather, is kidnapped, and someone else has to do the job, and the person who does it is Death, the skeletal, black-shrouded, scythe-carrying Grim Reaper. What on earth suggested to you that Death might make a good substitute for Father Christmas?
Well, the Death of Discworld knows an awful lot about human beings, because after all he meets so many of them, and he cares a lot for the humanity of human beings, if only because sometimes he must take it away. Also, of course, he knows where everybody lives. He can get down chimneys certainly as easy as the Hogfather can. He can effectively travel in time, which of course is what Father Christmas must do in order to get around the place. He shares quite a lot of characteristics in common. And indeed, Father Christmas, because let's be clear, that is who the Hogfather is undoubtedly a god if you look at all the attributes. He lives in some magical place. He can often be found in grottos. He can move from place to place instantly. He's omnipresent, if I may put it like that. God, that's quite a good one. I could have used that in the book. So there's certain commonalities there, and besides which, it made it a lot more fun.
What he doesn't understand, Death that is quite how things are supposed to be done. He has quite a problem for a while getting used to the idea of having to say ho, 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 which is something which the Hogfather has
I
to say.
think that the reason I did use Death, both for reasons of the Discworld as a series and in this book, Death knows about human beings. He watches what we do, and hears what we say. But he doesn't know how we think and feel. And he can't get his head around the idea of the Hogfather, of the myth and what it is supposed to mean and how it's supposed to work. And his innocence is our humour, if you like. We can laugh because he asks the same questions that a very small child would ask. And really, there are no logical answers. We do these things because we believe in them.
Well, in this extract from the book, he encounters a little child. He's in a department store in the great city of Ankh-Morpork on the Discworld. He's dressed as the Hogfather, and he's taken the place of a man who's pretending to be the Hogfather in order to give gifts to children who come into the store. The only thing is that Death's idea of the kind of gifts that a child ought to have and the Hogfather's aren't quite the same.
"What do you want for Hog's Watch?" said the Hogfather hurriedly. Mother took her economic cue again and said briskly, "She wants a—" The Hogfather snapped his fingers impatiently. The mother's mouth slammed shut. The child seemed to sense that here was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and spoke quickly.
"I want an army, and a big castle with pointy bits, and a sword."
"What do you say?"
"A big sword."
"You're supposed to say thank you."
"Thank you."
"And be good. This is part of the arrangement."
"Yes."
"Then we have a contract." The Hogfather reached into his sack and produced a very large model castle with, as correctly interpreted, pointy blue cone roofs on turrets suitable for princesses to be locked in, a box of several hundred assorted knights and warriors, and a sword. It was 4 feet long and glinted along the blade. The mother took a deep breath.
"You can't give her that. It's not safe."
"It's a sword. They're not meant to be safe."
"She's a child."
"It's educational."
"What if she cuts herself?"
"That will be an important lesson."
Do you ever contemplate and think what you've created in this character of Death? He's the only character that appears in every one of the Discworld novels. He's a character, isn't he, who has a kind of naivety, but also he has a human face. I mean, was that your intention, to give Death a human face?
Well, he could hardly have other than a human face, since we, after all, created him as a human skeleton, despite the fact that if we were logical, he would look slightly more like a beetle, because I suspect far more beetles die every day than humans. But we have the clear picture, and in many cultures there is this animate skeleton, and he harvests the souls of men. And who better to be a narrator about mankind and its foibles? He can never actually be a player on the stage, but he is there to pull the curtains down. One of the things I wanted to do in Hogfather was say that the whole idea of the midwinter ceremony, which is what Christmas is, and Hog's Watch, as it's called in Discworld, and that no one can argue with that. Central to the whole idea is death and rebirth. Now, there may be various masks that it wears, but death and rebirth and blood and the darkness and the fear that the sun won't rise in the morning are absolutely fundamental to it. And over the years, a veneer of things have accreted around it. And I'm sure my granny, when she put the silver sixpences in the Christmas pudding for us to find, would not think that what she had there was the faintest of faint echoes of the old King of the Bean ceremony from thousands of years ago, where if you found the hard bean in your food, which you ate at the special feast at the dark of the year, you then had 12 days of living high on the hog. You know, you could make love to as many women as you wanted and drink as much as you wanted and eat as much as you wanted. And then the druids would kill you, or whatever priests they were at the time, and your blood would water the soil and the crops would grow. Granny and her silver sixpence was a long way from that, but these little fossils have continued to exist. The fact that at Twelfth Night you must take down the Christmas decorations because the evil spirits hide in them. And the carol singers and all these things are evolutions of much earlier beliefs that went back thousands and thousands of years.
It seems to me that you're standing somewhere or other on the top of a mountain, somewhere or other in Discworld, pointing and saying to people, look at these things. If you look over there and you could see through that mist, through that fog, you will see something that you've forgotten that you once knew. Do you want to put people back in touch with some kind of...
An author should never actually tell you why he's doing it, in the same way that the conjurer should never show you the workings of the inside of the magic top hat. One of the things I do want to say, and possibly came right out with it in Hogfather, is to say that fantasy is not, in fact, the icing on the cake. Fantasy is the cake. That we believe that what distinguishes us from the lower, in inverted commas, animals, is our intelligence, which is not true. There are plenty of intelligent animals around of one sort or another, possibly not animals out there which would pass a human intelligence test, but they are intelligent all right. They have a general apprehension of the world. Anyone that's ever owned a particular black cat or dog for a long period of time will have seen a mind in there somewhere. It won't necessarily be a human mind, but it is a mind. It's not just an animal brain ticking over. What distinguishes us from the animals is our imagination, the ability to make up in our heads different worlds. And that world may simply be the equation, what happens if I throw this rock at that antelope? What happens is tomorrow's dinner. But the ability to stand aside and write these little film scripts in our head, in other words, to make images, which is what imagination actually means, that is a human trait. Very occasionally, animals show something like this, but we do it all the time. We do it most noticeably in stories and in movies and all the variations on this. But we're always living in what I call a diffused time zone. We always live a bit in the future and a bit in the past and a bit in the present. We're always doing things because of what happened yesterday and what we think are going to happen tomorrow. We live in a world of imagination. We constantly shape these new futures in our head to try them out. And if you like the classic fantasy, the fairy tales, the sort of things that I do, the mythology, these are kind of cliches of fantasy. These are bits in the toolbox. These are things that we can try to see if they fit. They're like an exercise bicycle for the mind. They might not actually take you anywhere, but they're really going to strengthen the muscles that will do so.
Terry Pratchett, thanks very much for talking to me.
Thank you.